The call came in at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that should have been like any other in the small agricultural town of Parlier, California. Detective Sarah McMahon had been sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup when the radio crackled to life, dispatching her to apartment 4B at the Sunset Gardens complex on the edge of town. The name of the complex was a cruel joke. There were no gardens, and the only sunsets visible from the cramped units were those filtered through the haze of pesticide drift from the surrounding orange groves. Maya Santoro was 23 years old when her landlord found her body sprawled across the threadbare carpet of her studio apartment. The contradiction hit everyone who knew her like a physical blow. Maya was the kind of person who brought homemade tamales to elderly neighbors and always had exact change ready at the grocery store checkout. She was the girl who still called her mother every Sunday without fail, who never left dirty dishes in the sink, who couldn't even kill the spiders that occasionally wandered into her apartment from the fields beyond. Yet there she lay, her life violently ended in a place where the most exciting thing that typically happened was the annual Peach Festival. The apartment itself told a story of modest dreams and careful budgeting. A single mattress on the floor pushed against the far wall, covered with a handmade quilt that Elena Santoro had sewn for her daughter's 18th birthday. A small television perched on a cardboard box that doubled as an entertainment center. The kitchenette contained exactly 4 plates, 4 cups, 4 sets of silverware, just enough for Maya to host her parents and younger brother for dinner on the rare occasions they could make the drive from Modesto. On the narrow counter sat a ceramic jar labeled LA Fund in Maya's careful handwriting, containing exactly $47.38 in crumpled bills and loose change. But it was the walls that revealed Maya's true aspirations. Dozens of headshots were tacked to the faded paint, 8x10 glossy photographs that had cost her 2 weeks of tips from her waitressing job at Mel's Diner. Maya smiled from every angle, her dark eyes bright with the kind of optimism that small towns either nurture or crush entirely. Between the headshots were printed emails from talent agencies, casting calls she'd responded to, and a single callback notice for a commercial advertising a regional car dealership that she'd framed like a diploma. The scene that greeted Detective McMahon that morning was one that would haunt her for the next decade. Maya's body showed signs of a violent struggle. Furniture overturned, her belongings scattered across the linoleum floor like the remnants of a life interrupted mid-sentence. The front door had been left ajar, swaying slightly in the morning breeze that carried the scent of orange blossoms and something else, something that didn't belong in this quiet corner of agricultural California. What struck McMahon most was the silence. In a complex where the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors' television programs and late-night phone conversations, nobody had heard anything. Mrs. Rodriguez in 4A claimed she'd been watching her telenovelas until midnight and heard nothing unusual. The college student in 4C had been wearing headphones while studying. The young couple in 4D insisted they'd been asleep by 11 p.m. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, Maya Santoro had died alone and unheard. The responding officers had already contaminated much of the scene by the time McMahon arrived. Parlier wasn't equipped for this kind of investigation. Their police force consisted of 6 officers who typically dealt with agricultural equipment theft, domestic disputes, and the occasional drunk driver. The county coroner wouldn't arrive for another 3 hours, and the nearest forensics team was in Fresno, 45 minutes away, on a good day. By the time proper investigative protocol could be established, crucial evidence had been compromised, photographed incorrectly, or overlooked entirely. Maya's car, a 1998 Honda Civic with peeling paint and a cracked windshield, sat untouched in the parking lot. Her purse was found on the kitchen counter with her wallet intact, containing her driver's license, a debit card, and the business cards of 3 different talent agents in Los Angeles. Her cell phone was missing, though the charging cable remained plugged into the wall beside her bed. Most puzzling of all was the absence of her laptop, a used MacBook she'd purchased with her tax refund earlier that year, which every friend and family member knew she treated like a precious possession. The apartment's single window faced the orange groves that stretched toward the horizon, their neat rows disappearing into the morning mist. From that window, Maya could see the highway that led to Los Angeles, the ribbon of asphalt that represented her pathway to a different life. She'd often told her mother that she could visualize her future from that window, could see herself driving past those groves one day in a car that didn't require constant repairs, heading toward auditions that would change everything. Now that window looked out on the same unchanging landscape, but Maya would never see it again. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew her. She died in the very place she'd worked so hard to escape, killed in a town where everyone claimed to know everyone else, where secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. Yet someone had entered Maya Santoro's life, ended it with brutal efficiency, and disappeared back into the agricultural maze of Central California as if they'd never existed at all. Maya Elena Santoro had been born with stars in her eyes, or at least that's what her mother Elena used to say. From the time she could walk, Maya was performing, singing into hairbrush microphones, putting on elaborate productions for her stuffed animals, and memorizing entire movies that she'd act out scene by scene for anyone willing to watch. In a family where her father Roberto worked double shifts at the cannery and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet, Maya's theatrical dreams seemed both precious and impractical. Growing up in Modesto, Maya was the kind of student who excelled despite circumstances that might have defeated others. She maintained a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at a local grocery store, saving every penny she could for headshots and acting classes. Her drama teacher, Mrs. Patterson, later told investigators that Maya possessed a rare combination of raw talent and work ethic that she'd encountered maybe twice in 30 years of teaching. Maya never missed rehearsals, was always the first to memorize her lines, and had an intuitive understanding of character that impressed even the visiting directors who occasionally judged their school competitions. But it was Maya's move to Parlier at age 21 that marked the beginning of her real pursuit of acting. The decision baffled her family and friends. Why leave the relative sophistication of Modesto for an even smaller agricultural town? The answer lay in a chance encounter at a regional theater audition in Fresno. David Fitzgerald, a talent manager who claimed connections throughout Los Angeles, had approached Maya after her audition for a community theater production of Our Town. He was older, probably in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a way that seemed foreign in the Central Valley, and he spoke with the kind of confidence that made Maya's heart race with possibility. Fitzgerald had been charming in that first meeting, held at a Starbucks near the theater. He ordered expensive drinks without looking at prices, spoke casually about directors and casting agents as if they were personal friends, and showed Maya photographs on his phone of young actors he claimed to represent who were now working on television shows she recognized. More importantly, he seemed to see something in Maya that others had missed, a quality he called authentic relatability that he insisted was exactly what casting directors were seeking. The proposal had seemed too good to be true, and perhaps it was. Fitzgerald told Maya that he was expanding his talent roster and looking for fresh faces to represent. He had contacts at several major agencies in Los Angeles, but he preferred to work with actors outside the city initially, helping them develop their skills and build their resumes before making the leap to Hollywood proper. What Maya needed, he explained, was to establish herself in smaller markets first. Commercials, local television spots, industrial videos. Parlier, he claimed, was perfectly positioned for this kind of work. Close enough to Fresno's growing media market, but far enough from the oversaturated pools of actors in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Maya had been skeptical at first. Her parents were openly suspicious of any offer that seemed too generous, too convenient. But Fitzgerald had references, other young actors who spoke glowingly of his guidance, casting directors who confirmed they knew him, even a few small but legitimate credits that he'd helped secure for his clients. More compelling than any reference, though, was the contract he offered Maya. Unlike the pay-to-play schemes that preyed on desperate actors, Fitzgerald's agreement specified that Maya would pay no upfront fees. Instead, he would take a standard 20% commission only after she booked paying work. The move to Parlier had been Maya's declaration of independence and commitment to her craft. She'd found the studio apartment through a classified ad, paid the first month's rent with money she'd saved from 2 years of weekend catering jobs, and begun building what she believed would be the foundation of her acting career. Her job at Mel's Diner was meant to be temporary, just enough income to cover basic expenses while she auditioned for the commercial and industrial work that Fitzgerald promised to secure for her. For the first 8 months, the arrangement had seemed to work exactly as advertised. Fitzgerald got Maya auditions for 3 different car dealership commercials, a training video for a regional bank, and even a small speaking role in an independent film being shot in Fresno. She didn't book every job, but her callback rate was higher than she'd ever experienced. More importantly, Fitzgerald seemed genuinely invested in her success. He drove to Parlier regularly for what he called career development meetings, helping Maya refine her headshots, practice her audition technique, and develop the kind of professional demeanor that would serve her well in Los Angeles. Maya documented much of this journey on social media, sharing behind-the-scenes photos from her auditions and posting updates about her progress that painted a picture of an actor on the rise. Her Instagram account, which investigators would later scrutinize frame by frame, showed a young woman who appeared confident and happy. Photos of Maya in her Mel's Diner uniform were captioned with jokes about paying dues. Selfies from audition waiting rooms included hashtags like "Dreams Come True" and "Small Town to Hollywood." But there were subtle signs that all was not as perfect as Maya's public persona suggested. Friends noticed that she'd become increasingly secretive about the details of her work with Fitzgerald. When pressed for specifics about upcoming projects or the timeline for her eventual move to Los Angeles, Maya would become vague, changing the subject or claiming that the entertainment industry required discretion about future opportunities. Her best friend from high school, Jessica Martinez, later told investigators that Maya had seemed stressed during their last few phone conversations, mentioning complications with her career that she couldn't or wouldn't elaborate on. The most telling evidence of Maya's state of mind came from her journal, which investigators found hidden beneath her mattress. The entries from her final weeks revealed a young woman grappling with growing doubts about her professional relationship with Fitzgerald. She wrote about discrepancies in the payment for her commercial work, expressing confusion about why her earnings seemed lower than what had been promised. More troubling were her questions about Fitzgerald himself. She'd begun to research his background more thoroughly and had discovered inconsistencies in his stories about his industry connections and previous successes. Maya's final journal entry, dated just 3 days before her death, contained a single ominous line that investigators would return to repeatedly throughout their investigation. "I think I know what's really going on, and I don't think I can pretend I don't anymore." Below that, in different ink as if added later, she had written a phone number with no identifying information, a number that would prove crucial to understanding why Maya Santoro had to die. The Parlier Police Department had never handled a homicide investigation of this magnitude. In the 10 years prior to Maya Santoro's death, their most serious cases had involved armed robberies at the truck stop off Highway 99 and a domestic violence incident that had escalated to assault with a deadly weapon. Chief Robert Quinn, a 22-year veteran who had risen through the ranks primarily due to his ability to navigate small-town politics rather than his investigative acumen, found himself completely unprepared for the media attention and procedural complexities that Myers' case would demand. The first critical error occurred within hours of the body's discovery. The responding officers, Patrolman Jake Murphy and Lisa Chen, had cordoned off the immediate area around Myers' apartment, but failed to secure the entire building or parking lot. Residents continued to come and go, potentially contaminating evidence trails that might have led investigators to crucial discoveries. Mrs. Rodriguez from 4A, eager to be helpful, had swept the hallway outside her door that very morning, unknowingly destroying possible trace evidence. The apartment complex's dumpster had been emptied by the waste management company before anyone thought to examine its contents, taking with it whatever the killer might have discarded during their escape. Detective McMahon, the department's only investigator with any serious crimes experience, arrived at the scene to find that the initial photography had been handled by Officer Murphy using his personal camera, a consumer-grade digital model that lacked the resolution and technical specifications required for forensic documentation. Crucial evidence, such as potential fingerprints on the doorframe and blood spatter patterns on the walls, had been captured with improper lighting and angles, rendering the images virtually useless for later analysis. The chain of custody protocols, which McMahon had learned during a weekend seminar in Fresno 3 years earlier, were implemented inconsistently at best. The absence of Myers' laptop immediately struck McMahon as significant, but the department lacked both the technical expertise and the legal framework to properly investigate digital evidence. When they contacted the FBI's regional office in Sacramento, they were told that federal resources would only be deployed if there was evidence of interstate crimes, or if local authorities could demonstrate that the case exceeded their capabilities. Since Myers' death appeared to be an isolated incident with no obvious federal jurisdiction issues, the Parlier PD was essentially on their own. Fitzgerald became a person of interest within the first 48 hours, simply because he was among the last people known to have contact with Myers. However, his initial interview revealed the department's investigative limitations almost immediately. Conducted in Chief Quinn's cramped office with its wood-paneled walls and outdated recording equipment, the session lasted less than an hour. Fitzgerald arrived with a lawyer, a sleek, expensive attorney from San Francisco who seemed to treat the entire proceeding as an inconvenience rather than a serious investigation. The talent manager presented a carefully constructed timeline of his final interactions with Myers. He claimed they had met for coffee at a Starbucks in Fresno on the Friday before her death, discussing upcoming audition opportunities and her long-term career strategy. According to Fitzgerald, Myers had seemed enthusiastic and optimistic about her prospects, mentioning several projects she was excited to pursue. He produced receipts from their meeting, text message exchanges that appeared routine and professional, and contact information for 3 witnesses who could verify his whereabouts during the estimated time of Myers' death. What Detective McMahon found most troubling about the interview wasn't what Fitzgerald said, but how he said it. His responses seemed too polished, too perfectly coordinated with his attorney's subtle signals. Every answer addressed the question asked, while volunteering no additional information. When McMahon asked about Myers' missing laptop, Fitzgerald claimed no knowledge of her personal computing habits. When pressed about financial arrangements between them, he produced a standard talent management contract that appeared entirely legitimate and properly executed. The department's inability to properly analyze digital evidence became apparent when they attempted to examine Myers' cell phone records. Her device was missing, but they could obtain call logs and text message metadata from her service provider. However, The technical complexity of interpreting this information exceeded their capabilities. The logs showed numerous calls and messages between Maya and Fitzgerald, but without access to the actual content, investigators could only speculate about the nature of their communications. Text messages that might have revealed Maya's concerns about her professional relationship existed only as numerical codes and timestamps that the Parlier PD couldn't properly decode. More frustrating was their handling of Maya's social media presence. Her Instagram and Facebook accounts contained hundreds of posts and interactions that could have provided crucial insights into her state of mind and relationships. However, the department lacked both the legal authority and technical knowledge to properly preserve and analyze this digital evidence. By the time they contacted the platforms requesting information, some posts had been deleted, comments had been removed, and the algorithmic nature of social media feeds had altered the context of remaining content. The physical evidence collection was hampered by the department's limited forensic capabilities. Maya's apartment contained dozens of fingerprints, but Parlier PD had no automated fingerprint identification system and had to rely on manual comparison with a limited database of local offenders. DNA evidence collection followed proper protocols, but processing required sending samples to the state laboratory, where backlogs meant results wouldn't be available for months. Hair and fiber evidence was collected but never properly analyzed due to budget constraints and the department's unfamiliarity with specialized forensic vendors. Perhaps most damaging to the investigation was the department's failure to properly canvass the surrounding area for witnesses and evidence. The orange groves that bordered the apartment complex provided numerous potential hiding spots and escape routes, but investigators never conducted a thorough search beyond the immediate vicinity of Maya's building. Security cameras from nearby businesses were never checked, and potential witnesses who might have been traveling on the adjacent highway during the relevant time period were never identified or interviewed. The media attention that began to build around Maya's case after the first week created additional pressure on the understaffed department. Reporters from Fresno and even Sacramento began calling for updates, and Chief Quinn found himself struggling to balance transparency with the need to protect the investigation's integrity. His daily briefings often revealed more about the department's limitations than about the case's progress, inadvertently signaling to Maya's killer that law enforcement was struggling to build a coherent case. By the end of the first month, crucial leads had gone cold, not due to lack of evidence, but due to the department's inability to properly identify, collect, and analyze the information that was available. Fitzgerald had returned to Los Angeles, maintaining minimal contact with investigators and referring all inquiries to his attorney. Maya's electronic devices remained missing. Her social media accounts had been memorialized by family members, potentially altering their evidentiary value, and the physical crime scene had been released back to the landlord, who had already begun preparing the apartment for a new tenant. Detective McMahon knew they were losing the case not to criminal sophistication, but to bureaucratic and technical inadequacies. Each day that passed without progress made it less likely that Maya Santoro's killer would ever be brought to justice, a reality that weighed heavily on an investigator who had never felt more aware of her department's limitations. Elena Santoro's world ended on a Tuesday morning when Detective McMahon's voice came through the phone, carefully professional but unable to mask the gravity of what she was about to relay. The words seemed to reach Elena through layers of impossibility. Maya was dead, found in her apartment, circumstances suspicious, investigation underway. Roberto was at work when Elena called him, her voice so broken that he initially thought something had happened to their younger son, Miguel. When she finally managed to tell him about Maya, Roberto dropped the phone and sat down heavily on the loading dock behind the cannery, staring at the stacks of produce crates as if they might explain how his daughter could simply cease to exist. The drive from Modesto to Parlier had never seemed so long. Elena clutched Maya's last voicemail message on her phone, playing it repeatedly during the 40-minute journey. Maya had called the previous Sunday evening, as she did every week, chatting about her work at the diner, complaining about a customer who had left no tip, mentioning that she was excited about some upcoming auditions. Her voice had sounded normal, happy even. Elena would replay that message thousands of times over the coming years, searching for any hint of fear or distress that she might have missed, any clue that could have prepared them for what was coming. The apartment complex looked even shabbier in the harsh afternoon light, surrounded by police vehicles and crime scene tape that seemed absurdly dramatic for such a quiet, unremarkable place. Elena's first instinct was to rush to Maya's door, to see her daughter one more time, to somehow reverse what had happened through sheer maternal will. Detective McMahon gently but firmly explained that the apartment was still being processed as a crime scene, that Maya's body had already been removed, that there was nothing Elena could do except provide information that might help find who had done this terrible thing. The questions began immediately and never seemed to end. Did Maya have any enemies? Had she mentioned feeling threatened? What about boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, anyone who might have had romantic or professional conflicts with her? Elena answered as thoroughly as she could, but the reality was that Maya had become increasingly private about her personal life since moving to Parlier. The daughter who had once shared every detail of her day had begun keeping secrets, explaining away her mother's concerns with vague references to the entertainment industry's need for discretion. Roberto's response to grief was action. Within days of Maya's death, he had taken unpaid leave from the cannery and begun conducting his own investigation. He printed hundreds of flyers with Maya's photograph and distributed them throughout Parlier and Fresno, asking anyone with information to contact the police. He visited every business within a 5-mile radius of Maya's apartment, showing her picture to employees and customers, asking if anyone remembered seeing her during her final days. His methodical, determined approach revealed information that the official investigation had missed. A gas station attendant who remembered Maya filling up her Honda on the Saturday before her death, looking upset and talking animatedly on her phone. Elena's approach was different but equally consuming. She began documenting everything she could learn about Maya's life in Parlier, creating detailed timelines of her daughter's activities, relationships, and professional engagements. She established contact with Maya's co-workers at Mel's Diner, her neighbors at the apartment complex, even casual acquaintances from the grocery store and laundromat. What emerged was a portrait of a young woman who had been well-liked but increasingly isolated. Someone who had begun to withdraw from casual friendships while maintaining a determinedly optimistic public facade. The revelation that Maya had been working with a talent manager named David Fitzgerald hit Elena like a physical blow. Maya had never mentioned him by name, referring only to "my manager" during their Sunday phone calls. Elena's attempts to contact Fitzgerald directly were unsuccessful. His phone number went straight to voicemail, and his Los Angeles office claimed he was unavailable for comment. The attorney who had accompanied Fitzgerald to his police interview refused to provide Elena with any information, citing client privilege and the ongoing investigation. As weeks turned to months with no arrests, Elena's frustration with the official investigation grew into something approaching fury. Detective McMahon was clearly doing her best with limited resources, but Elena could see the case sliding toward the realm of unsolved files and cold case statistics. The media attention that had initially seemed promising began to fade as other stories claimed headlines. Maya's death, which had briefly made Elena believe that justice was inevitable, was becoming just another tragedy that people would eventually forget. Roberto's health began to suffer under the strain of their search for answers. He developed insomnia, lying awake at night, replaying every interaction he'd had with Maya during her final months, wondering if he'd missed warning signs or failed to ask the right questions. His blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels, requiring medication that he often forgot to take. Elena watched her husband aging visibly, consumed by a grief that manifested as relentless, exhausting activity. The financial burden of their private investigation was crushing. Roberto's unpaid leave from the cannery meant reduced income precisely when they needed resources most. Elena took on additional house-cleaning clients, working evenings and weekends to pay for the gas required for Roberto's daily trips to Parlier, for the copies of flyers and posters, for the private investigator they briefly hired before determining they couldn't afford his services. Their savings account, which had been modest but stable, drained steadily as they pursued every possible lead. The hardest part was the isolation. Friends and extended family members were initially supportive, bringing casseroles and offering condolences. But as time passed without resolution, people began to treat Maya's death as something Elena and Roberto needed to move on from. The suggestion that they should focus on healing rather than investigation felt like betrayal. How could they heal while Maya's killer remained free? How could they move forward when justice remained unserved? Eleanor began keeping a detailed journal of their investigative efforts, partly to organize information and partly to preserve evidence of law enforcement's inadequacies. Her entries documented not just facts and leads, but the emotional toll of fighting for attention in a system that seemed designed to forget victims like Maya. She wrote about the frustration of calling Detective McMahon for updates and being told that the case remained active while receiving no concrete evidence of progress. She documented the patronizing responses from officials who seemed to believe that grief was clouding her judgment when she pressed for more aggressive investigative measures. The journal also captured Elena's growing certainty that someone was actively working to keep Maya's case from being solved. The missing laptop, the convenient alibis, the way Fitzgerald had seemingly vanished from their lives as completely as he had entered, these weren't coincidences. Someone with resources and connections was ensuring that Maya's death remained a mystery. And Eleanor began to understand that finding justice would require more than cooperation with official channels. It would require a fight that could consume the rest of their lives, a battle against forces that had already proven capable of taking everything that mattered most to them. By the spring of 2015, Maya Santoro's murder had officially joined the ranks of unsolved cases that haunt small police departments across America. Detective McMahon's requests for additional resources had been denied repeatedly, and Chief Quinn made it clear that the department couldn't justify continuing to dedicate significant manpower to a case that had produced no viable suspects or actionable leads. The file boxes containing Maya's evidence were moved from McMahon's desk to a storage room in the basement of the police station, where they joined dozens of other cases that had grown cold through lack of progress rather than lack of trying. The transition from active investigation to cold case happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Phone calls from reporters became less frequent, then stopped entirely. The FBI regional office closed their consultation file on the case, noting that no federal crimes could be established and that local authorities appeared to have exhausted conventional investigative approaches. Maya's social media accounts, which had been monitored for months in case her killer attempted to access them, were finally turned over to her family for memorial purposes. Elena and Roberto Santoro refused to accept this bureaucratic surrender. They had spent their life savings hiring private investigators, consulting with former law enforcement officers, and even engaging a psychic whose services had been recommended by another grieving mother they'd met at a victims' rights conference. Each avenue had led to dead ends that were emotionally devastating and financially ruinous. The private investigator, a former Fresno County Sheriff's deputy named Tom Gallagher, had initially seemed promising. He'd identified several inconsistencies in Fitzgerald's timeline and had begun building a profile of the talent manager's business practices that suggested a pattern of exploitation. But Gallagher's investigation hit the same wall that had stopped the official inquiry. Without access to Fitzgerald's financial records, without the ability to compel testimony from his associates, without the digital evidence that might have revealed the true nature of his relationship with Maya, even the most experienced private investigator could only develop theories rather than proof. After 6 months and nearly $15,000 in fees, Gallagher had to tell the Santoros that he'd exhausted every lead that could be pursued without law enforcement powers. Meanwhile, David Fitzgerald's career appeared to flourish with each passing year. Elena had begun monitoring his professional activities obsessively, tracking his social media presence and following entertainment industry publications that occasionally mentioned his work. The man who had been present during Maya's final weeks was building an impressive roster of clients, representing actors who landed roles in major television productions and commercial campaigns. His agency, Fitzgerald Talent Management, moved to increasingly prestigious addresses in West Hollywood, and industry publications began featuring him in articles about successful mid-tier representation. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Elena. While her daughter lay buried in Modesto's Catholic cemetery and her killer remained free, Fitzgerald was attending award shows, posting photographs from industry parties, and celebrating his clients' successes as if Maya had never existed. Elena screenshot every public appearance, every professional milestone, building a digital archive that documented Fitzgerald's continued prosperity while Maya's case grew colder with each passing month. Roberto's health continued to deteriorate under the sustained stress of their fruitless search for justice. His blood pressure medication required constant adjustment, and he developed a persistent tremor in his hands that made his work at the cannery increasingly difficult. Elena watched her husband disappearing before her eyes, consumed by a grief that had calcified into something approaching obsession. He spent hours each evening reviewing Maya's case files, searching for connections that investigators might have missed, calling law enforcement offices across California to ask if similar crimes had been reported in their jurisdictions. The couple's relationship with Miguel, their surviving child, became strained as their focus narrowed to Maya's case. Miguel, who had been 15 when his sister died, struggled through his remaining high school years with parents who were physically present but emotionally unavailable. He'd loved Maya deeply, but he also needed parents who could help him navigate his own grief and continue building his life. Instead, he found himself living with 2 adults who seemed frozen in 2014, unable to engage with any reality that didn't involve seeking justice for their dead daughter. Detective McMahon, though officially reassigned to other cases, couldn't entirely let go of Maya's investigation. She continued to review the evidence files during quiet moments, hoping that fresh eyes might reveal something she'd missed during the initial investigation. Her periodic updates to the Santoros became increasingly difficult to deliver. There were no new leads to report, no forensic breakthroughs, no witnesses who had come forward with additional information. The case had simply stalled in the most frustrating way possible, not from lack of evidence that a crime had occurred, but from inability to connect available evidence to any identifiable perpetrator. The Parlier community, which had initially rallied around Maya's memory with vigils and fundraisers for the investigation, gradually moved on to other concerns. The apartment complex where Maya had lived underwent renovations, and her unit was eventually rented to a family that knew nothing about its history. Mel's Diner, where Maya had worked her final shifts, hired new waitresses who served the same customers without carrying the weight of tragedy that had once permeated the establishment. By 2018, Maya's case had become a cautionary tale rather than an active investigation. Criminal justice students at nearby colleges occasionally wrote papers about the procedural failures that had compromised the evidence collection. Victims' rights advocates pointed to Maya's case as an example of how resource-poor departments struggled with complex investigations. Elena was sometimes invited to speak at conferences about the challenges facing families of unsolved murder victims. Though these appearances were emotionally excruciating and provided no practical progress toward finding Maya's killer. The most painful aspect of these cold case years was watching how thoroughly Maya's life had been reduced to a statistic. The vibrant young woman who had dreamed of Hollywood success, who had brought tamales to elderly neighbors, who had called her mother every Sunday, had become nothing more than a case number in filing systems across multiple agencies. Her photographs, once displayed hopefully on casting directors' desks, now appeared only in memorial posts on social media and in the missing persons databases that Eleanor checked compulsively, despite knowing that Maya would never be found alive. Elena's journal entries from this period reveal a mother grappling with the possibility that justice might never come. She wrote about dreams where Maya appeared to offer forgiveness for her parents' inability to solve her murder, and nightmares where Fitzgerald appeared at family gatherings as if nothing had happened. The entries documented not just the investigation's failures, but the slow erosion of hope that had once sustained Elena through the darkest periods following Maya's death. As 2019 turned to 2020, Elena began to accept that she might die without ever knowing who had killed her daughter or why. The realization was devastating, but it also carried an unexpected element of clarity. If traditional investigative methods had failed, if law enforcement resources were inadequate, if private investigators had reached dead ends, then perhaps the only option was to wait for time and circumstance to reveal what active investigation had not been able to uncover. Detective Lisa Anderson arrived at the Parlier Police Department in January 2024 with a reputation for solving cold cases through digital forensic techniques that had been unavailable to earlier generations of investigators. She'd spent 15 years with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office, where she'd specialized in cases involving digital evidence recovery, social media analysis, and financial crimes investigation. Her transfer to Parlier was part of a state-funded initiative to provide smaller departments with access to advanced investigative capabilities, and Chief Quinn had specifically requested her assignment based on her success rate with previously unsolved cases. Anderson's first week on the job was spent reviewing active cases and identifying cold case files that might benefit from modern investigative techniques. Maya Santoro's murder immediately caught her attention, not just because of its tragic circumstances, but because of the obvious digital evidence gaps that had hampered the original investigation. The missing laptop, the absent cell phone, the superficial analysis of social media communications, these were precisely the areas where technological advances might provide breakthrough opportunities. Her initial review of the case files revealed investigative approaches that had been competent by 2014 standards, but were woefully inadequate by contemporary measures. The original investigators had never obtained search warrants for Maya's cloud storage accounts, had failed to preserve her digital communications beyond basic call logs, and had never conducted forensic analysis of her online financial activities. More importantly, they had never examined David Fitzgerald's digital footprint with the thoroughness that his central role in Maya's life warranted. Anderson's first breakthrough came through a technique that hadn't existed during the original investigation. Maya's MacBook, which had never been recovered, had been configured to automatically back up to Apple's iCloud service. The original investigators had been unaware of this feature and had never requested access to Maya's cloud storage account. Anderson's warrant application, supported by detailed technical explanations of cloud backup protocols, was approved within days of submission. The data recovery process took weeks to complete, but the results were extraordinary. Maya's iCloud account contained not just backed up files from her missing laptop, but also synchronized data from her iPhone, including text messages, emails, and app data that painted a comprehensive picture of her final months. The information revealed patterns of communication and behavior that completely altered Anderson's understanding of Maya's relationship with Fitzgerald and the circumstances surrounding her death. The recovered text messages showed a dramatic evolution in Maya's relationship with her talent manager. Early communications were professional and optimistic, focusing on audition opportunities and career development strategies. But beginning in August 2014, just months before her death, the tone shifted dramatically. Maya had begun questioning Fitzgerald about discrepancies in her earnings, expressing concerns about commissions that seemed higher than their contract specified, and asking for detailed accounting of money that was supposedly being held in trust for her. Fitzgerald's responses to these inquiries were initially reassuring, but became increasingly evasive as Maya's questions grew more specific and persistent. He claimed that entertainment industry accounting was complex, that temporary holds on payments were routine, that Maya's concerns reflected inexperience rather than actual problems. But Maya's recovered files showed that she had been conducting her own investigation, researching entertainment law, contacting other actors who had worked with Fitzgerald, and building a case that suggested systematic financial fraud. The most damaging discovery was a series of spreadsheet files that Maya had created to track her earnings and expenses. These documents, which would have been devastating evidence during the original investigation, showed that Fitzgerald had been taking commissions significantly higher than their contract allowed and had been collecting fees for services that were never provided. Maya had calculated that she was owed nearly $8,000 in improperly withheld earnings, a substantial sum for someone living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment. Anderson's analysis of Maya's email accounts revealed even more troubling patterns. Maya had been corresponding with a forensic accountant in Los Angeles, seeking advice about how to document financial fraud and recover stolen money. She had also been in contact with other actors who claimed to have similar experiences with Fitzgerald, building what appeared to be an informal network of potential witnesses to his fraudulent practices. Most significantly, Maya had been preparing to file complaints with both the California Labor Commissioner and the Better Business Bureau. The digital evidence also revealed the identity behind the mysterious phone number in Maya's final journal entry. The number belonged to Amanda Stewart, a former client of Fitzgerald's who had successfully sued him for financial fraud in 2013. Stewart had been providing Maya with detailed information about legal strategies for recovering stolen money, and had been encouraging Maya to document everything about her professional relationship with Fitzgerald. Their communications showed that Maya had been planning to confront Fitzgerald about the financial discrepancies during their next meeting, a confrontation that would have threatened not just his relationship with Maya, but his entire business model. Anderson's financial investigation capabilities, enhanced by access to digital tools unavailable in 2014, allowed her to trace patterns of money movement that supported Maya's fraud allegations. Banking records obtained through expanded warrant authority showed that Fitzgerald had been systematically overcharging his clients, collecting fees for services never rendered, and maintaining complex financial arrangements that obscured the true nature of his business operations. The breakthrough moment came when Anderson discovered that Maya had been using a digital recording app on her phone to document her conversations with Fitzgerald. The audio files, automatically backed up to her cloud storage, captured dozens of hours of conversations that revealed a man whose carefully maintained professional facade concealed predatory business practices and an increasing awareness that Maya posed a serious threat to his operations. In one recording, made just 5 days before Maya's death, Fitzgerald could be heard explicitly threatening Maya's career prospects if she continued pursuing her financial complaints. He warned that entertainment industry blacklists were real and permanent, that actors who gained reputations as difficult or litigious would never work in Los Angeles, that Maya's dreams of Hollywood success would die if she didn't drop her fraud allegations immediately. Maya's response, captured in crystalline digital audio, was a young woman who had moved beyond intimidation to determination. She told Fitzgerald that she had documented everything, that other actors were prepared to support her claims, that she wasn't going to be silenced by threats or professional retaliation. The recording ended with Maya informing Fitzgerald that she expected full repayment of stolen money within 30 days and that her attorney would be filing formal complaints regardless of any career consequences. For Anderson, this digital evidence represented the foundation of a criminal case that should have been built a decade earlier. The recovered files didn't just establish motive for Maya's murder, they provided a detailed record of the systematic fraud that had motivated it, the specific threats that had preceded it, and the evidence that Maya had been prepared to use to destroy Fitzgerald's career and potentially land him in prison. The question now wasn't whether Fitzgerald had killed Maya Santoro, but whether enough physical evidence remained after 10 years of degradation and neglect to support the digital case that Anderson was building. The technology that had finally revealed the truth about Maya's death would now need to be combined with traditional investigative techniques to ensure that justice, however delayed, could finally be served. Detective Anderson's investigation into David Fitzgerald's business practices revealed a criminal enterprise that had been operating under the guise of talent management for more than a decade. The digital evidence recovered from Maya's cloud storage was just the beginning of a pattern that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of victims who had never realized they were being systematically defrauded by someone they trusted with their career aspirations. The forensic accounting analysis that Anderson commissioned revealed the sophisticated nature of Fitzgerald's operation. He had established multiple business entities with names that sounded legitimate: Fitzgerald Talent Management, West Coast Artist Development, California Creative Services, but which served primarily to obscure money trails and create confusion about contractual obligations. Young actors would sign with one entity while payments flowed through others, making it nearly impossible for clients to track their earnings or verify that contractual terms were being honored. Fitzgerald's client contracts themselves were masterpieces of legal deception, written in dense entertainment industry jargon and filled with provisions that seemed standard to inexperienced actors. They contained clauses that allowed him to collect fees far in excess of industry norms. He charged development fees for services that were never provided, marketing fees for promotional activities that never occurred, and administrative fees that had no legitimate business purpose. Most insidiously, he structured payment schedules so that actors often received initial payments that seemed appropriate, only to discover later that larger sums were being withheld indefinitely. Anderson's expanded investigation identified at least 37 actors who had worked with Fitzgerald between 2010 and 2024. And preliminary financial analysis suggested that he had stolen more than $400,000 through his fraudulent practices. The victims were almost exclusively young, inexperienced actors from small towns and rural areas. People like Maya who had limited knowledge of industry standards and few resources to challenge questionable business practices. What made Fitzgerald's operation particularly effective was his careful selection of victims. He targeted actors who were geographically isolated from entertainment industry centers, who lacked family connections in the business, and who were financially vulnerable enough that they couldn't afford legal representation if disputes arose. He cultivated relationships with community theater directors, acting coaches, and talent scouts in small markets throughout California and neighboring states, building a pipeline of potential victims who were delivered to him already convinced of his legitimacy and expertise. The digital evidence revealed that Fitzgerald maintained detailed profiles of his clients that went far beyond professional information. He documented their family backgrounds, financial situations, personal relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities in files that read like intelligence dossiers rather than talent management records. Maya's file, which Anderson found particularly chilling, contained notes about her close relationship with her parents, her financial struggles, her tendency toward people-pleasing, and her high trust threshold with authority figures. More disturbing were Fitzgerald's notes about Maya's investigative activities during her final months. He had been monitoring her communications with other clients, tracking her research into entertainment law, and documenting her contacts with the forensic accountant and attorney. His notes revealed not just awareness of Maya's fraud investigation, but active countermeasures designed to discredit her claims and intimidate her into silence. He had contacted other clients to warn them against cooperating with Maya's inquiries and had begun building what he called a defensive narrative about her mental state and professional reliability. Anderson's analysis of Fitzgerald's financial records revealed the economic pressure that had motivated him to take increasingly desperate measures to protect his operation. His legitimate talent management activities generated minimal income. Most of his successful clients had eventually moved to larger agencies, taking their commissions with them. The fraudulent fees and withheld payments from vulnerable clients like Maya had become his primary income source, funding an expensive Los Angeles lifestyle that included a Beverly Hills apartment, luxury car payments, and the kind of professional wardrobe and accessories necessary to maintain his successful manager persona. Bank records showed that by October 2014, Fitzgerald's financial situation had become critical. His overhead expenses exceeded his legitimate income by more than $8,000 per month, and several clients had begun demanding accounting that would have exposed his fraudulent practices. Maya's threat to file formal complaints represented more than just the loss of one client. It threatened to trigger investigations that could have revealed his entire operation and resulted in criminal charges that would have ended his career and possibly landed him in prison. The recovered digital communications revealed that Fitzgerald had consulted with at least 2 different attorneys about his legal exposure if clients began filing fraud complaints. The attorneys' responses, preserved in email attachments, painted a grim picture of potential civil and criminal liability. Under California law, his systematic overcharging of clients could be prosecuted as grand theft, while his fraudulent business practices might trigger federal mail and wire fraud charges that carried lengthy prison sentences. Anderson's investigation also uncovered evidence that Maya wasn't Fitzgerald's first victim to threaten legal action. In 2013, Amanda Stewart had successfully sued him for financial fraud, resulting in a settlement that had required him to pay substantial damages while admitting no wrongdoing. The settlement agreement included a non-disclosure clause that prevented Stewart from publicly discussing the case, but her private communications with Maya showed that she had been encouraging other victims to come forward and document their experiences. 2 other former clients had contacted attorneys about potential fraud claims, though neither had pursued formal action. One, a young actor named Kevin Sullivan, had died in a car accident in 2016 before his planned lawsuit could be filed. The other, Jennifer Boyle, had moved back to her hometown in Oregon and abandoned her acting career rather than continue fighting Fitzgerald's legal team. Anderson's interviews with both Stewart and Boyle revealed a pattern of intimidation and legal manipulation designed to silence victims and protect Fitzgerald's operation. The digital evidence also revealed Fitzgerald's growing paranoia during Maya's final weeks. His internet search history showed extensive research into private investigation techniques, employee monitoring software, and legal strategies for dealing with disgruntled former clients. He had purchased spy software designed to monitor Maya's phone and computer activities, though Anderson's technical analysis couldn't determine whether he had successfully installed it on her devices. Most chilling were the notes Fitzgerald had made about permanent solutions to his client problems. While never explicitly discussing violence, his private documents contained research into insurance policies, accident statistics, and legal precedents for cases where client disputes had been resolved through natural circumstances. His web browser history included searches for terms like untraceable methods, accidental death investigations, and small-town police capabilities. The picture that emerged from Anderson's investigation was of a man who had built his entire adult life on systematic fraud, who had carefully constructed a professional reputation that concealed predatory business practices, and who had been willing to use any means necessary to protect his operation when threatened with exposure. Maya Santoro hadn't been killed in a moment of passion or during a random crime. She had been eliminated because she represented an existential threat to a criminal enterprise that had been carefully constructed over more than a decade. For Anderson, the evidence revealed not just why Maya had been killed, but why her case had been so difficult to solve. Fitzgerald hadn't been a typical suspect whose guilt might be revealed through traditional investigative techniques. He had been a sophisticated criminal who had spent years perfecting methods for exploiting vulnerable people and evading accountability for his actions. Only the digital evidence that he couldn't have anticipated or controlled had finally revealed the true scope of his operation and the calculated nature of Maya's murder. The arrest warrant for David Fitzgerald was signed by Judge Patricia Morrison at 8:43 a.m. on a Thursday morning in March 2024, nearly 10 years after Maya Santoro's murder. Detective Anderson had spent 6 weeks building a case that combined the recovered digital evidence with new financial analysis and witness testimony from Fitzgerald's other victims. The warrant charged him with first-degree murder, financial fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud, charges that could result in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Anderson knew that arresting Fitzgerald would require careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. He maintained residences in both Los Angeles and San Francisco, traveled frequently for business, and had sufficient resources to flee the country if he became aware of the investigation. The arrest operation was planned for maximum impact and minimum opportunity for escape, targeting Fitzgerald at his Beverly Hills office during regular business hours when his location could be confirmed and controlled. The Fitzgerald Talent Management Office occupied the 3rd floor of a gleaming glass building on Rodeo Drive, its prestigious address carefully chosen to project success and industry credibility. Anderson had conducted surveillance for 3 days to establish Fitzgerald's routine, noting that he typically arrived at his office around 10 a.m. and remained there until mid-afternoon, taking meetings with clients and conducting business that appeared entirely legitimate from external observation. At 11:15 a.m., Anderson and 3 other officers entered the building's marble-clad lobby, their plain clothes and professional demeanor causing no alarm among the fashionably dressed visitors and employees who populated the high-end commercial space. The building's security desk noted their arrival, but had no reason to question their stated business with Fitzgerald Talent Management. Anderson's team took the elevator to the 3rd floor, walking past the agency's impressive glass doors with their gleaming logo and professional reception area. Fitzgerald was in his private office when Anderson knocked, conducting a phone call with someone he addressed as a casting director. Through the office's floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Los Angeles stretched toward the Pacific Ocean, a vista that spoke of success and influence that contrasted sharply with the squalid apartment in Parlier, where Maya had lived and died. Fitzgerald gestured for Anderson to wait, finishing his call with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he had no awareness of the investigation that had been building around him for months. The moment of recognition was subtle but unmistakable. When Anderson identified herself as a law enforcement officer and began to explain why she was there, Fitzgerald's expression shifted from mild annoyance to controlled alarm to something approaching panic as the implications of her words became clear. His first response was to reach for his phone, presumably to call his attorney, but Anderson informed him that he was being arrested and advised him of his rights before he could make any calls. The handcuffs seemed incongruous in the expensive office environment, their metallic click echoing off glass surfaces and leather furniture that represented the lifestyle Fitzgerald had built through years of systematic fraud. His employees and clients in the reception area watched in stunned silence as he was escorted past them, his careful composure cracking as the reality of his situation became undeniable. The perp walk from the building to the unmarked police car drew immediate attention from pedestrians and businesses along Rodeo Drive. Fitzgerald, impeccably dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than Maya had earned in 3 months of waitressing, looked profoundly out of place in restraints. His professional image, dissolving as cell phone cameras, captured his arrest for posting on social media and sharing with local news outlets. The booking process at the Beverly Hills Police Department revealed additional details about the scope of Fitzgerald's criminal activities. His personal effects included multiple credit cards, identification documents for several business entities, and a cell phone that Anderson immediately secured for forensic analysis. His wallet contained business cards from expensive restaurants, exclusive clubs, and luxury service providers, the props necessary to maintain his successful manager persona while systematically stealing from vulnerable clients. News of Fitzgerald's arrest spread through entertainment industry networks with remarkable speed. By evening, the story had been picked up by major trade publications and entertainment news programs. Industry professionals who had known Fitzgerald professionally expressed shock and disbelief, describing him as someone who had seemed entirely legitimate and professionally competent. Several prominent actors who had worked with him in ancillary capacities issued statements through their representatives, distancing themselves from his actions while expressing sympathy for his victims. The revelation that Fitzgerald had been arrested for murder rather than simply financial fraud sent additional shockwaves through both the entertainment industry and the small Central Valley communities where his victims had lived. Maya Santoro's name, which had largely faded from public consciousness during the cold case years, suddenly returned to headlines as reporters began investigating the connection between her unsolved murder and the arrest of a seemingly successful talent manager. Elena Santoro received the call about Fitzgerald's arrest from Detective Anderson personally, a courtesy that acknowledged the years of frustration and heartbreak that Elena had endured while seeking justice for her daughter. Elena's initial reaction was disbelief. After so many years of disappointment and false hope, the idea that Maya's killer had finally been identified seemed too good to be true. When the reality of the situation began to sink in, Elena experienced a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and renewed grief that her daughter's death had been confirmed as the calculated murder she had always believed it to be. Roberto's response to the news was more complicated. The decade-long search for Maya's killer had consumed his health, his marriage, and much of his relationship with his surviving son. The confirmation that Fitzgerald was responsible provided answers to questions that had tormented him for years, but it also forced him to confront the reality that Maya's death hadn't been random or preventable through better parental protection. It had been the result of her own integrity and courage in standing up to a predatory criminal. The arrest also triggered a wave of new victims coming forward with their own stories of exploitation and fraud. Actors from across the western United States contacted law enforcement agencies, victims' rights organizations, and entertainment industry publications with accounts of financial manipulation, professional sabotage, and intimidation tactics that painted a picture of criminal behavior that had extended far beyond Maya's case. For the residents of Parlier, Fitzgerald's arrest provided a sense of closure to a tragedy that had haunted their small community for a decade. Maya had been one of their own, a young woman whose dreams had seemed both inspiring and achievable until her life was cut short by violence that seemed to belong to a different, more dangerous world. The revelation that her killer had been a sophisticated criminal operating from Beverly Hills, rather than a random local predator, somehow made her death both more tragic and more comprehensible. Detective Anderson found the arrest personally satisfying, but recognized that it represented only the beginning of a legal process that would require months or years to complete. The digital evidence that had identified Fitzgerald as Maya's killer would need to be presented in court, where defense attorneys would challenge every aspect of the investigation and attempt to create reasonable doubt about their client's guilt. The case that seemed ironclad to investigators would face scrutiny from legal professionals whose job was to find weaknesses and inconsistencies that might free their client. As Fitzgerald spent his first night in custody, the magnitude of the charges against him began to sink in for everyone involved in the case. This wasn't just about financial fraud or professional misconduct. It was about the calculated murder of a young woman whose only crime had been refusing to be silenced about the theft of her earnings and the destruction of her dreams. The news of David Fitzgerald's arrest reached Parlier through the interconnected networks that bind small agricultural communities together. Phone calls between neighbors, conversations at the post office, updates shared over coffee at Mel's diner where Maya had worked her final shifts. The revelation that their hometown tragedy had been solved after a decade of uncertainty created a complex emotional response that rippled through the community in ways that surprised even long-time residents who thought they understood how their neighbors processed grief and justice. At Mel's diner, where Maya's photograph still hung behind the counter alongside other local high school graduates who had made something of themselves, the morning coffee crowd gathered with an intensity that hadn't been seen since the immediate aftermath of her death. Veteran waitress Carol Mendez, who had trained Maya and watched her develop from a nervous teenager into a confident young woman, found herself crying unexpectedly as she wiped down tables that Maya had once served. The tears came not from renewed grief, but from a relief she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for 10 years. The knowledge that Maya's killer had finally been identified and would face justice. The conversations at Mel's revealed how profoundly Maya's unsolved murder had affected the community's sense of safety and trust. For a decade, residents had lived with the possibility that her killer might be someone they knew, someone who walked among them undetected and unpunished. Parents had modified their children's freedoms, women had changed their daily routines, and the general assumption that serious violent crime happened in other places to other people had been permanently shattered by Maya's death. Roberto Martinez, the apartment complex manager who had discovered Maya's body, had never fully recovered from that traumatic morning. He had moved away from Parlier within a year of the murder, unable to continue living in a place where he was constantly reminded of finding a young woman's lifeless body in an apartment he had helped her secure. The news of Fitzgerald's arrest reached him at his new home in Bakersfield, where he had spent years trying to forget the details of that terrible discovery. For Martinez, the arrest provided a kind of closure that allowed him to acknowledge how profoundly the experience had affected his mental health and his relationship with his family. The agricultural workers who formed the backbone of Parlier's economy had their own complicated relationship with Maya's case. Many were immigrants who maintained complex relationships with law enforcement, and Maya's unsolved murder had reinforced their existing distrust of police effectiveness and commitment to protecting vulnerable community members. The revelation that her killer had been a wealthy Los Angeles businessman rather than someone from their own community provided a different kind of validation, confirmation that the violence in their lives often came from outside forces that viewed them as expendable. At the high school, where Maya had once starred in theatrical productions, her former drama teacher organized an assembly to discuss the case resolution with students who had never known Maya personally but had grown up hearing her story. The assembly became an unexpectedly emotional event as teachers and community members shared memories of Maya that painted a picture of a young woman whose ambition had been coupled with genuine kindness and integrity. Students who had never heard detailed accounts of Maya's life learned about someone whose dreams had been similar to their own, whose death had resulted from her refusal to accept being victimized by someone she trusted. The revelation of Fitzgerald's systematic fraud operation created additional trauma for community members who had believed Maya's association with a professional talent manager represented a success story for their small town. Parents who had used Maya's example to encourage their own children's artistic aspirations now had to process the reality that her apparent professional progress had actually been part of a criminal scheme that had ultimately cost Maya her life. The discovery that Maya had been killed, not despite her success, but because of her integrity and challenging criminal behavior, transformed community understanding of both her life and her death. Elena Santoro's return to Parlier for media interviews following Fitzgerald's arrest became a community event that revealed how Maya's case had affected relationships throughout the town. Elena had been largely absent from Parlier social circles during the cold case years, her grief and frustration making it difficult to maintain normal community connections. Her reappearance as the vindicated mother of a murder victim, whose killer had finally been caught, created opportunities for conversations that had been avoided for years. The reunion between Elena and Maya's former co-workers at Mel's Diner was particularly emotional. These women had watched Maya balance her dreams with the practical necessity of earning money, had covered her shifts when she had auditions, had celebrated her bookings, and consoled her after rejections. They had also lived with 10 years of wondering whether they had missed warning signs that might have saved her life. The confirmation that Maya had been killed by someone whose criminal sophistication had exceeded local law enforcement capabilities provided a kind of absolution for people who had spent a decade questioning whether they could have done something differently. The broader agricultural community that surrounded Parlier also grappled with the implications of Maya's case resolution. The revelation that a predatory criminal had been specifically targeting young people from rural and small-town backgrounds created new awareness of vulnerabilities that many parents had never considered. The entertainment industry, which had seemed like a distant and generally benign aspiration for artistically inclined young people, was suddenly revealed as containing sophisticated predators who specifically sought victims from communities like theirs. Local law enforcement's response to Fitzgerald's arrest was complicated by the recognition that their initial investigation had been inadequate. Chief Quinn, who had overseen the original case, was nearing retirement and struggled with the knowledge that better resources and techniques might have solved Maya's murder years earlier. His public statements following the arrest attempted to balance acknowledgement of investigative limitations with defense of his department's efforts, but community members who had followed the case closely understood that systemic failures had allowed Maya's killer to remain free for a decade. The memorial service organized to mark the case resolution drew attendees from throughout the Central Valley, including former classmates who had moved away, community members who had known Maya only peripherally, and law enforcement officers who had worked on various aspects of the investigation over the years. The service revealed how Maya's story had become part of the collective memory of multiple communities, representing not just a personal tragedy, but a symbol of vulnerability, persistence, and eventual justice. For Detective Anderson, observing the community's response to Fitzgerald's arrest provided insight into how unsolved crimes affect entire communities, rather than just immediate family members. The decade of uncertainty had created a shared trauma that extended far beyond Maya's personal relationships, affecting community trust, individual behavior patterns, and collective assumptions about safety and justice. The case resolution provided healing opportunities for people who hadn't realized how profoundly they had been affected by Maya's unsolved murder. The most profound community reckoning came through recognition that Maya's integrity and courage had ultimately led to justice, not just for herself, but for dozens of other victims of Fitzgerald's criminal operation. Community members who had known Maya as a kind, determined young woman began to understand that her decision to challenge Fitzgerald's fraud had represented the same character traits that had made her beloved in Parlier. Her refusal to accept unfairness, her commitment to standing up for what was right, her belief that honest people deserved protection from those who would exploit them. The trial of David Fitzgerald began in August 2024, 13 months after his arrest and nearly 10 years after Maya Santoro's murder. The proceedings took place in Fresno County Superior Court, where District Attorney Michael Garcia had assembled a prosecutorial team specializing in complex financial crimes and digital evidence presentation. The courtroom gallery was filled daily with Maya's family members, other fraud victims, law enforcement officers who had worked the case, and media representatives covering what had become a high-profile example of delayed justice in the digital age. Fitzgerald's defense team, led by prominent criminal attorney Sarah Walsh, faced the challenging task of creating reasonable doubt about evidence that appeared overwhelming to casual observers. Their strategy focused on questioning the reliability of 10-year-old digital evidence, challenging the chain of custody for recovered files, and arguing that financial fraud, however reprehensible, did not constitute proof of murder. They portrayed Fitzgerald as a flawed businessman whose questionable practices had been unfairly escalated into capital murder charges by prosecutors seeking to close a cold case that had embarrassed local law enforcement. The prosecution's presentation of Maya's recovered digital files proved devastatingly effective with the jury. The audio recordings of Fitzgerald threatening Maya's career, combined with the detailed financial documentation of his fraudulent practices, created a narrative of escalating criminal behavior that culminated logically in murder when Maya refused to be silenced. Detective Anderson's testimony about the systematic nature of Fitzgerald's victim selection and fraud operation painted a picture of a predator who had viewed young actors as resources to be exploited rather than clients to be served. The testimony of other fraud victims provided crucial context for understanding Fitzgerald's criminal psychology and operational methods. Amanda Stewart, whose earlier lawsuit had provided Maya with initial guidance about challenging Fitzgerald's fraud, described a pattern of intimidation and retaliation that had continued for years after their legal settlement. Kevin Sullivan's sister testified about her brother's planned lawsuit and his mysterious car accident, though the court ruled that evidence about Sullivan's death was not directly relevant to Maya's case. Elena Santoro's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Her description of Maya's character, dreams, and final weeks provided the jury with a human context for the digital evidence and financial documentation that formed the prosecution's case. Elena's composure during cross-examination, where defense attorneys attempted to suggest that Maya might have been unstable or unreliable, demonstrated the same strength that had sustained her through a decade of seeking justice for her daughter. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Fitzgerald showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but the courtroom erupted in tears and applause from Maya's supporters and other victims who had waited years for this moment. Judge Morrison sentenced Fitzgerald to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his systematic victimization of vulnerable young people and his calculated murder of Maya Santoro represented crimes that demanded the most severe punishment available under California law. The resolution of Maya's case had implications that extended far beyond Fitzgerald's conviction. The entertainment industry began implementing new oversight mechanisms for talent representatives, including mandatory reporting requirements and enhanced background checks for agents and managers working with inexperienced actors. The Screen Actors Guild updated their guidance materials to help young performers identify and report fraudulent business practices, using Maya's case as an example of how exploitation could escalate to violence. Law enforcement agencies throughout California updated their protocols for investigating crimes involving digital evidence, recognizing that the techniques that had finally solved Maya's case needed to become standard practice rather than specialized capabilities. The state funded additional training programs for small department investigators, ensuring that future cases wouldn't be compromised by lack of technical expertise or inadequate resources. For Elena and Roberto Santoro, Fitzgerald's conviction provided closure that had seemed impossible during the decade of uncertainty following Maya's death. Elena resumed her house-cleaning work, finding peace in the routine tasks that had once seemed meaningless during the consuming search for justice. Roberto returned to the cannery with renewed purpose, channeling his energy into mentoring younger workers rather than obsessing over investigative details. Their relationship with Miguel, strained by years of grief-focused priorities, slowly began to heal as they learned to discuss Maya's memory without being consumed by the trauma of her murder. Detective Anderson used Maya's case as the foundation for specialized training programs about cold case investigation and digital forensics. Her presentation at law enforcement conferences across the country emphasized the importance of preserving digital evidence and the potential for technological advances to reveal crucial information that had been invisible to earlier investigators. Maya's case became a textbook example of how persistence, advanced techniques, and community support could achieve justice even in seemingly hopeless situations. The broader impact of Maya's case resolution extended to academic and policy discussions about victim protection in predatory industries. Criminal justice researchers studied Fitzgerald's operation as an example of how sophisticated criminals exploit vulnerable populations, while entertainment industry organizations developed new protocols for protecting young performers from fraudulent representatives. Maya's legacy was formalized through the establishment of the Maya Santoro Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial resources to young performers facing exploitation. The foundation, supported by donations from entertainment industry professionals and crime victims' advocates, offers services that might have saved Maya's life: forensic accounting for suspicious financial arrangements, legal representation for fraud victims, and educational programs about recognizing and reporting predatory behavior. The impact on Parlier itself was profound and lasting. The community's experience with Maya's case led to enhanced cooperation with law enforcement agencies and increased awareness of how small towns could be targeted by sophisticated criminals. Maya's photograph at Mel's Diner, was joined by information about resources for reporting financial fraud and exploitation, transforming her memorial into an educational tool that might protect future victims. As the legal proceedings concluded and media attention gradually shifted to other stories, those who had been most affected by Maya's case began the process of integrating her memory into their ongoing lives. The girl who had dreamed of Hollywood success while serving coffee in a small agricultural town had become something she never could have imagined, a symbol of integrity, courage, and the possibility that justice, however delayed, could ultimately prevail against those who prey on the vulnerable. For investigators, victims' families, and community members who had been touched by Maya's story, the case resolution provided not just answers about her death, but affirmation that persistence in seeking truth and justice could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal deception. Maya Santoro's murder had been solved not through luck or coincidence, but through the determined efforts of people who refused to let her death be forgotten or her killer remain free. The technology that had finally revealed the truth about Maya's death would continue advancing, potentially solving other cold cases and preventing future crimes through enhanced investigative capabilities. But the human elements that had driven the case to resolution, family love, investigative dedication, community support, and refusal to accept injustice, represented timeless values that no amount of technological progress could replace. Maya Santoro's case reminds us that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, and that the fight for truth requires both advanced investigative techniques and unwavering human commitment. If you found this investigation compelling, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts about how communities can better protect vulnerable members from sophisticated predators. The conversation about justice and protection must continue if we hope to prevent future tragedies like Maya's.